I'm a literature scholar, so there is going to be close reading, and that close reading is going to be of Ayn Rand's novels. We can brace ourselves. But really what I want to do today is essentially, I'm presenting and kind of illustrating the argument that my book manuscript is making. So I'm kind of giving the broad argument of that, and then one kind of illustrative example. So here we go. Neoliberalism, financialization, post-industrial society, empire, network society, late capitalism, petrocapitalism, cybernetic capitalism, digital capitalism, secular stagnation, information society, post-Fordism, new spirit of capitalism. These are all terms used to characterize the social, political, economic, ecological, and political transformations that have taken place following the collapse of the post-war deal or Keynesianism of the 1940s to the 1970s. These terms are not necessarily mutually exclusive and are often used in concert, but where a thinker puts her emphasis shapes how she periodizes and makes sense of this post-1973 world, which we still somewhat at least inhabit. To focus on financialization or secular stagnation is often to root the primary driver of history within the internal contradictions of capitalism itself. To focus on automation and the rise of digitality is to prioritize the role of technological transformation. To focus on the term neoliberalism is to emphasize how processes like financialization or automation were always political decisions made to maintain and extend ruling class power, generally within a larger framework of US global hegemony. Or at least I think this is what using the term neoliberalism should do. And yet, as many have suggested, the popularity of the term neoliberalism both indexes and exacerbates a retreat from anti-capitalist analysis and a narrowing of the task specifically of the cultural critic to defending principles of democracy or pluralism against the market. And such a critique, I think, is not without merit. One only needs to turn to the work of someone like Wendy Brown, who's highly influential. Undoing the Demos is really a kind of dirge, a mournful dirge for how neoliberalism saturates all spheres of human activity with a kind of market logic and how it assaults the principles, practices, cultures, and institutions of democracy. Right? And Brown and many others end up often setting up a kind of simple neoliberalism democracy opposition, which effaces the myriad ways in which the welfare state and Keynesianism, for some, often meant invasion, dispossession, and marketization for many others. And so the question that my book is looking into, and what I want to talk about today, is the question of how we maintain the political import and relevance of the term neoliberalism for describing the transformations that capitalism undergoes in the post-1973 period. Right? How do we maintain that kind of central link between a critique of capitalism and one of neoliberalism? And I think that a lot turns on how we historicize the roots of neoliberalism. And so today what I'm really going to argue is that while to understand neoliberalism, we do need to follow intellectual historians who have traced it back to its flashpoints in Chile and New York, right? And this is Harvey, and then those who argue we have to go back from Chile and New York to the 1950s. We need to do so not by thinking only about neoliberalism's intellectual history, so here generally, right, Hayek and Friedman in The Mountain in Mont Pelerin, but rather to the material and spatial origins of neoliberalism in the so-called post-war deal. Right? I think there's also really important work to be done on foreign policy and neo-colonialism, which I think is going to be done later. But what I want to do today is to show the importance of rooting neoliberalism in the urban and suburbanization projects of the US, and especially New York in the 1950s. So I'm arguing that one of the key origins for neoliberalism is in this kind of radical urbanization project that happens in the US in the 50s. So that is, I'm arguing neoliberalism's cultural, affective, and subjective origins lie, at least partially, in these mass urbanization projects that are called urban renewal. So that's my first claim. Second is that because so much post-war American literature engages with this radical transformation of space, post-war US literature, particularly literature of the 50s and 60s, is a really useful place to think about the origins of neoliberal ideology. And to make this point, I'm going to turn to one, I think, particularly important novel about urban renewal, which is Ayn Rand's 1957 novel, Atlas Shrugged. So just briefly before I turn to how that's going to work, what do I mean when I say urban renewal? So Beginning in 1949, New York became ground zero for a nationwide experiment that would become international that is often called urban renewal. And urban renewal aimed to respond to what planners, politicians, and downtown business interests worried was an irreversible urban decline resulting from the interconnected processes of a great migration of Blacks, Latinos, and Puerto Ricans into the city and a flight of industry, commerce, and the white tax base out of the city and into the suburbs. Empowered by the Housing Act of 1949, the first national policy designed to deal with overcrowding and urban blight, New York effectively bulldozed most of its kind of downtown core in order to make way for modern housing and cultural complexes, freeways, public and private housing projects, medical centers, and commercial skyscrapers, all of which promised to restore profitability and order to a decaying downtown center. Taken together, these processes transformed New York's metropolitan region in as dramatic and wrenching a fashion as Baron von Haussmann's creative destruction of Paris a century before. And part of what was so transformative, what was so dramatic about this transformation is that it also embedded a new separation between races. Almost as soon as the Housing Act was drafted, Frank Horn, who was then the head of the Housing and Home Finance Agency's Race Relations Services, warned that this act would likely harden into brick and mortar the racially restrictive practices of private real estate and lending operations. And Horn would be proved right. In the ensuing years, urban renewal contributed significantly towards a new ideological and spatial regime of segregation. Ideologically, urban renewal allowed for a seemingly race-neutral economic arguments that declining property values ideologically, urban renewal allowed for seemingly race-neutral economic arguments about declining property values to replace older arguments based on biological differences. While physically, urban renewal provided a legal framework and federal funds to respatialize and fracture the city into spacious, private, middle-class housing developments for whites in the suburbs and constrictive public and poor ghettos for Blacks in the downtown core. As civil rights activist and staff of Roosevelt's Fair Employment Practices Committee, Clarence Mitchell, put it, what the courts have forbidden state legislature and city councils to do, and what Ku Klux Klan was not able to accomplish by intimidation and violence, the present federal housing policy is accomplishing through a monumental program of segregation. So through urban renewal, race was so thoroughly absorbed into the circuits of housing capital that when suburban housing protesters in the 1970s started calling for cuts to taxes and cuts to public service provisions, these are the kind of suburban protesters that would lead to Reagan's election, they never needed to talk about race. Public already signified racialized and Black, and private already signified white. And so what this means is that when neoliberalism, when the kind of ideology of neoliberalism and privatization is good kind of erupted in the US in the 70s and 80s, that was already thoroughly a racialized logic. And that's where it got a lot of its ideological force. So perhaps then it's unsurprising that Ayn Rand, who is that kind of ideological architect of neoliberalism, developed and fleshed out her ideas about the economics most clearly in a novel that is about the destruction and renewal of New York, Atlas Shrugged. While it's not often read as such, Atlas Shrugged's focus on urbanization and suburbanization and her direct engagement with the contours of racialized post-war urban policy underpins, shapes, and provides the language and subjectivities through which neoliberalism would gain hegemony. And so what I want to do is kind of read a bit of this novel for you guys to kind of show how this is going to work. So Atlas Shrugged opens with the main character, a railway magnate, Dagny Taggart, and her assistant. And when the novel opens, her assistant, Eddie Willers, is strolling through a seemingly war-torn New York City, looking at its streets, houses, stores, and factories, which are all abandoned, emptied, or destroyed. And the novel opens with three observations that Eddie makes that seem at first disconnected. First, he argues that the skyscrapers look like an old painting in oil. Second, that he hates the new electronic calendar that the mayor had erected last year. And third, that the plenitude of commodities in the one store window on Fifth Avenue comfort him greatly, as, quote, he liked to see objects made by men to be used by men. These full windows, however, also arouse a kind of feeling of the uncanny in him. They trigger an uncomfortable childhood memory of an oak tree that was struck by lightning. And he recalls the shock that came to him as he looked at this lightning-struck tree. And I think one of the questions I want to kind of open with is, what's going on where this kind of stroll through the streets of New York trigger this kind of memory? The blasted oak tree of Eddie's childhood recalls the opening scene of Mary Shelley's classic novel, Frankenstein, where Dr. Frankenstein recalls his own childhood experience witnessing a storm reduce an old tree to a blasted stump. And the doctor here explains that we found the tree not only splintered by shock, but entirely reduced to thin ribbons of wood. When the doctor asks his uncle in awe what force had just reduced that tree to ribbons, his uncle responds, electricity. And this story of creative destruction both marks a kind of primal scene of Frankenstein's obsession with technology and progress, and like Karl Marx's sorcerer, who can no longer control the powers he has called up, foreshadows Frankenstein's downfall, his inability to harness the forces of nature he has conjured. Atlas Shrugged, however, is no Frankenstein. And so where Frankenstein is a novel about the horrific consequences of modernity, Atlas Shrugged is going to celebrate modernity and refigure these kind of Promethean shocks as those that are necessary for the cleansing of the post-war Keynesian state, who she calls the looters in the novel, which I'm going to refer to at some point, and the production of a new utopic market-driven society. And so one of the things that the novel is trying to really do here is to transform modernity's metaphor from Prometheus to Atlas, right? From a model of modernity rooted in traumatic shock and deadly compulsion and destruction to one rooted in strength, stability, domination, and flexibility. The character of Atlas in Atlas Shrugged is the kind of capitalist figure of John Galt, a low-level employee for Dagny's railroad company who is also building and destroying the infrastructure underpinning New York City's economy and ultimately a US-driven capitalist world system. When the novel begins, though, Dagny is trying to save the city and her family's railway from two threats. So first, this looter state, which we're supposed to understand as the Keynesians, and then second, an elusive figure that she calls the destroyer, who is disappearing the country's most innovative and competent industrialists, artists, and thinkers, who the novel terms men of the mind. This is a very weird novel, which I've read now 4 times, unfortunately. As the novel develops, Dagny has to learn, right, that the destroyer is actually John Galt, this Atlas figure, and the disappeared men are not actually disappeared, they're just on strike, right? They're just the capitalists on strike. And that they do not actually seek to destroy capitalism, but rather to save it. And so the novel's really following Dagny as she realizes that what she thinks is the destroyer is the redeemer, and that she must join the men of the mind and give up her attachments to a railway company and to her city in order to save the city and transform herself into this kind of man of a mind. Importantly, I think Atlas Shrugged, though, to make this novel plays out, it emerges out of and it participates in debates surrounding the future of America's cities at a time when the often opposing forces of urban sprawl, suburbanization, urban decay, and urban renewal were making that future increasingly uncertain. What Rand calls a strike is both a capital strike, but is also an enactment of the twin processes of residential and industrial white flight to the suburbs. While Eddie and Dagny's own encounter with the decaying city simply rehearses the myriad white flight narratives that cast the post-war city as a war zone that shocks and traumatizes the working and middle-class white subject who has to leave. But as I said, Atlas Shrugged is going to work by ultimately refusing this position of victimization and instead imagining the shocks and traumas of this urban core as an ultimately therapeutic force that will purge the characters and their reader of their kind of attachment to the city and create a new, self-reliant, resilient, entrepreneurial subject and city. By the 1950s, Frankenstein was a very apt analogy for the vertiginous rise and fall of the US's great industrial cities, which had, with the Great Depression of the 1930s, gone from representing the American promise of endless growth and prosperity to serving as a symbol of decline, unemployment, and a foreclosed industrial past. And all of Eddie's observations about the city, right, make clear that New York is that destitute city that needs to be saved. And so the problem that the novel faces, again, is how to save the city. And Dagny Taggart is the one who initially is confident she can save it. And the solution she offers at first is very much in line with all of the ideas of post-war rebuilding. So Dagny begins as a modernist, right? She lives in a kind of glass-sheeted skyscraper. She tries to work with the state, investing her large capital in infrastructure projects. But she soon realizes that all of her attempts to save the city within the kind of old framework are in vain, right? No matter how hard she tries to work to save the city from blight, the blighted city will consume her. And so she finds herself increasingly unable to overcome chronic mismanagement, bad government policy, and industrial decline that threaten to destroy her business. At the same time, she herself finds herself physically swallowed up and lost in a maze of the city's abandoned buildings, dilapidated houses, and ruins. And so really the first part of the novel is that moment where she realizes the blighted city is kind of too much for her. At this point, the novel shifts and gives us a different vision of what a city could be. And this becomes the town of Atlantis, a private property enclave that is constructed by all of the men of the mind in the Midwestern mountains where they have disappeared. Rand's comparison of New York and Atlantis reads like any number of modernist architectural and urban planning visions for an alternative to these cities. Rand's Atlantis is kind of the perfect alternative to the city, where New York is directionless and chaotic, citizens stumble around a poorly designed and crumbling downtown. In Atlas, the buildings are new, well-designed, spacious, and maintained. The healthy inhabitants walk the streets with purpose. The factories and businesses are open and prospering. And where New York is a tangled mass of industrial, residential, and commercial neighborhoods, in Atlantis, everything is kind of well-designed. Atlantis, in other words, is really the model suburb, right? It is this new, perfectly designed, ordered city. And so I think stripped bare, one of the ways we should read Atlas Shrugged first and foremost is as a white flight novel, a novel about the processes of suburbanization, urban decay, and urban renewal. And I think what makes this process difficult to see, and one of the reasons people don't think about Ayn Rand in terms of cities, is that the novel completely erases race. In fact, except for one description of an elderly Indian servant to one of the men of the mind, there is literally no discussion of race in this novel. So that's the first reason. And second is Atlantis is not technically a suburb, it's in the Midwest mountains, so it rethinks the suburbs almost as a frontier village, right? It kind of constructs the sort of Western. And yet, I think ultimately this is exactly why Rand is kind of so important for both thinking about the transformation of American cities and of American capital. Because what Rand captures is the fusing of the 19th century frontier imagery and 20th century urban planning in her depiction of Atlantis. And so we start to see all of these ways in which Atlantis, in which the men live in frontiersmen's cabins that also have chrome and glittering stoves. So we start to see, so it starts to kind of echo both the Western with this kind of modernist architecture. More importantly, though, I think, is that the mythos of the frontier also points to the racial politics that are deeply embedded within Atlas Shrugged. So that is, one of the things that Western novels did is they whitewashed Western space. So where the West was actually kind of populated with Mexicans, Jews, Eastern Europeans, and African Americans, the Western made the West look white, this kind of pure Anglo-Saxon space. And so one of the things that Rand does is she recasts white flight into the terms of the frontier Western doing something different, creating a new kind of colorblind segregationist discourse for the post-Jim Crow era. Put in slightly different terms, Atlas Shrugged doesn't need to mention race because her descriptions of the decaying and blighted urban core is already coded within this new segregationist language of white flight, a language in which, again, private implicitly means white and good, and public implicitly means black and looter. In this context, Rand's articulation of the men of the mind's main strategy, the withdrawal of capital from public space and into the enclave of Atlantis, becomes all the more nefarious. At the end of the novel, Dagny tracks down her man of the mind, John Galt, to his home in New York City, which she discovers is located in a slum. And surveying this slum, Dagny is kind of shocked and asks Galt about his choice of abode. And he explains that no money that is earned in Atlantis, where his real home is, can ever be spent outside in the city. And so he works as a track laborer for Dagny to kind of live, to pay his rent and buy food in New York. This conversation, I think, at once reveals the actual state policies that created a system of economic and racial segregation between the wealthy suburbs and the impoverished central cities. Namely, again, the subsidizing and expansion of home ownership and industry in the former, and the underdevelopment and concentration of poverty in the latter. And yet, paradoxically, it does so while often giving voice to a moralizing fantasy of white flighters that government interventions were only helping the urban poor, where the deserving suburban homesteaders had earned their houses through independent hard work. This scene, I think, also reveals the deeper importance of the ideological fantasies underpinning white flight and suburbanization, and what they have in the forging of neoliberalism. John Galt, as we know, is both a great industrialist in Atlantis and is a poor track worker in New York. And this identity split between a blue-collar worker in the city and a successful entrepreneur and capitalist in the suburbs mobilizes a fantasy of suburbanization as upward class mobility, of the move from a dependent blue-collar laborer to an independent owner-operator. But it does so at the same time as that possibility is foreclosed. Class mobility does not exist within the novel. No character actually ascends. Instead of mobility, what the novel does offer is an alternative of identification. So in him, the subject position of the hardworking blue-collar white worker fuses with that of the capitalist. And so I think what this scene ultimately reveals is how the fantasy of white dispossession creates an ideological realignment in which blue and white-collar, primarily male workers come to distance themselves from the social welfare state and come to identify with the very processes of capital that are in fact dispossessing them. So, while Atlas Shrugged undoubtedly mobilizes feelings of dispossession underpinning white flight, its perspective is not actually that of the fleeing workers, but of capital itself. And this is why the novel doesn't end just with a white flight over to Atlantis. While suburbanization was crucial to solving the profitability crisis that marked the end of World War II, so too were the processes of creative destruction that played out in urban cores across the US. Capital, David Harvey writes, cannot abide limits. When it encounters limits, it works assiduously to convert them into barriers that can be transcended or bypassed. Following the post-war period, that limit was the suburbs, which, as William White notes, often got kind of coded as a frontier tradition. But by the beginning of the 1960s, that new frontier had shifted back to the city. Writing in the 1950s, Rand could not have known the specific shape that urban revolution would take in the 1970s and 1980s, once what Neil Smith has termed the new urban frontier became the frontier of profitability. But what Rand was able to clearly see from early on was the continued importance of the city to capital, even at the moment when urban space seemed to have been abandoned by capital and taken over by the state. Neil Smith again argues that with capital's return to the city, the imaginary of the urban similarly transformed from a wilderness, a chaotic environment of decay and decline, to a new frontier, a space of economic progress and historical destiny, rugged individualism and the romance of danger, national optimism, and race and class superiority. This is the transformation that both Dagny and the reader undergo as they reorient their perspective from one who experiences the city as a hopeless battle against blight, to that of John Galt, who embraces blight-ridden New York with all the excitement of a cowboy hidden west. And so again, while Dagny is initially horrified and terrified of the slums, Galt sees the slums as a laboratory. And the novel makes this very explicit. So while Galt seems to live in a tenement, again, this novel is insane, it turns out that this tenement actually holds within it the most efficient modern laboratory Dagny has ever seen, right? The slum in Atlas Shrugged is literally a laboratory. And again, where Dagny initially sees the city as a kind of blight, a traumatic shock, the men of the mind see in the slum the seeds of a new civilization that will supplant this looter state. And this change in perspective articulates the gulf that separates the subject positions of the embattled middle class and capital. While the middle class fleeing the city experience urban decay and blight as a shock that threatens them, capital views those same processes as creating new spaces of potential redevelopment. And so one way we can think about the problem that Atlas Shrugged ultimately tackles is how to shift readerly perspective from that of the shell-shocked working or middle-class subject who flees to the suburbs to that of capital, which understands the need for both. And here I think we really get to the importance of Atlas Shrugged in helping forge the imaginary of the entrepreneurial subject that would underpin neoliberalism. One of the things that Atlas Shrugged really suggests, and I think in some ways this goes back to what Ross was saying, is that what needs to change is not really necessarily reality, but perception, right? Dagny must learn that what she initially perceived as a breakdown of social order is actually a carefully planned and well-executed work of a capitalist class whose goal is the creation of this new metropolis. And like many of the modernist writers who Rand both draws on and critiques, the novel has all of these kind of long critiques of modernism, which are, I mean, also totally nuts, but kind of interesting. The center of this problem of perception is the question of shock. And I think this is interesting for any of us who have read Naomi Klein, obviously. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, artists and writers constantly drew a connection between modernity, industrialization, traumatic shock, and the callousing of human consciousness. And as I mentioned, Atlas Shrugged opens with that shock of the tree, right, that kind of resonates with Frankenstein. But for Rand, unlike the modernist that she breaks away from, shock is not constitutive to capitalist modernity, or an expression of capitalism's internal contradiction. It is the self-regulating system of a fully rational capitalist society when faced with the interventions of the state. So thus, in a novel that's full of kind of industrial accidents and traumatic shock, Atlas Shrugged recasts all of them as rational events that are doing the work of clearing the ground for this new kind of space. Throughout Atlas Shrugged, then, Rand is going to suggest that it is not shock, but the looter state's attempt to cushion the blows of shock, generally through anti-competition, foreign aid, social welfare, that is destroying society. The novel makes this kind of quite both psychologically and economically clear. So all of the men of the mind have mental health problems, they suffer mental breakdowns, they commit suicide, they just keep kind of falling apart, where in contrast, the men of the mind are completely unshockable. And again, this becomes really literal. At one point, this state, the looter state, captures John Galt. They literally attach him to a shock therapy machine and try to shock him into changing sides, and he breaks the machine, right? He is unshockable. They are kind of full of shock. And so we start to get here, I think, the kind of kernel of Rand's most dramatic intervention into mid-century politics and aesthetics. She's really doing that work of forging the neoliberal fantasy of shock therapy, right? This idea that if you can kind of get through the shocks, weather the shocks, come to identify with the shocks, you come out on the other side. So again, shock in Atlas Shrugged ceases to be something inherent within or a result of capitalist modernity. Capitalism is Prometheus. Instead, capitalist modernity becomes this strong, stable, and natural force. And in carrying out this transformation, the novel refigures the creative destruction of capitalist modernity into a process of personal salvation, one that, if submitted to, will lead to a stronger, more flexible human subject and a more modern, profitable, and healthy city. Shock then becomes at once reparative, ridding the system and the self of unnatural aberrations and separating out the fit from the unfit. And so all of the scenes of decline and shock become a test for the novel's readers. Will they be dupes of the leader state who take on the anxiety of their characters, or are they men of the mind who can see these passages as a rational and natural response to society, a kind of clearing of blighted ground? The ultimate test is a kind of sort of atom bomb that literally destroys the entire city. And so there's a kind of question, again, as to whether this is the natural result of the kind of looter state or not. And the way the novel ends is that with this kind of fake atom bomb, it is ultimately the victory of this kind of neoliberal state. The novel ends with New York completely cleared out, and with the kind of man of the mind, Midas Mulligan, sitting at his desk, listing the assets of his bank and working on a plan of projected investments, noting down the locations he was choosing. New York, New York, New York. Meanwhile, the man of the mind judge sits in his farm drafting new laws that forbid the abridging of production and trade. And finally, that man of the mind, John Galt, stands at the road that is going to lead back to New York and announces the road is clear. We are going back to the world. Reading these few pages, it's difficult not to be struck by the uncanny prescience of this scene, which was realized following the near bankruptcy of New York in the 1970s and the structural adjustment programs of privatization, deregulation, financialization, and gentrification that followed in its wake. And like the frontier narratives of gentrification that would follow, Rand too is able to turn the destruction of New York City's urban core into a Bildungsroman narrative for the embattled white flight reader who comes to identify capital's victory over the welfare state with their own personal success and salvation. Thanks.
Questions, please. Can I ask a question? Where do you think? I remember starting to read Atlas Shrugged, and I couldn't actually finish it, but it was that kind of almost kind of Nietzschean idea that she had that I found interesting. Where do you think she actually sat politically?
What do you mean, like where she sat politically?
Do you think that she was an advocate of kind of something like neoliberalism?
Do I think
she was an advocate of something like neoliberalism, as we understand it now, or?
Well, I mean, her individual politics are like very much in line with the kind of privatization, private property, free market politics. But I think in some ways what I want to kind of emphasize in this paper and in a lot of my work is that we do something kind of dangerous if we think that neoliberalism as an economic system just emerges right out of these kind of philosophical or economic ideas, right? I think a lot of those kind of philosophical or economic ideas get deployed in these kind of they get deployed, but they're not actually what happens, right? Like we all know that neoliberalism doesn't, for instance, require the kind of clawing back of the state. It doesn't in any way ensure kind of more liberty for individuals, right? In fact, people seem to be significantly less free as markets are more free, as Galliano said, right? So I think it's instead more about understanding how these ideas and these ideologies kind of capture people's imagination. And I think what Ayn Rand shows us really clearly is that the ways in which these kind of programs of these programs that would then be implemented and which really actually Latin American activists would start calling neoliberalism more primarily, they take hold because of the way in which they attach themselves to kind of racial anxiety, because of anxieties around like middle class dispossession and so forth. And so I think if we read Ayn Rand critically, what we can start to see is exactly what's lurking beneath those kinds of fantasies as they took hold in the 80s, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wondered, like, you were saying about there being this kind of frontier idea within the novel, and that's kind of what's driving the repopulation of the city within the novel. And I wondered, like, because that's pretty much happened like across the UK with regeneration. It's mainly been a population shift from the suburbs back into the city.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you've got any ideas about what you think drives that.
Yeah, so I think neoliberalism, it's useful to think about neoliberalism as distinctly American, not in the sense that every country doesn't have its own form of neoliberalism and its own histories of neoliberalism, but that neoliberalism takes American ideas of freedom and globalizes them in some way, right? And so I think one of the things for me that's like interesting here is New York is one of the kind of really early moments of gentrification, right, starting in the 1980s, and that wherever capital goes, it's going to take its kind of founding ideas of freedom. And so in the 19th century, that was the expansion to the West, right? And those Western novels that were written in like 1900 were written as narrative fantasies to explain capital's kind of spread across the West. And so I think it makes perfect sense that once cities are abandoned and they become again a kind of terra nullius to be reappropriated, they latch onto that ideology, right? And so one of the things that I think is so interesting, and Neil Smith makes this argument, he says when capital started flooding back into New York in the 1980s, all of these cowboy-themed bars popped up, and all of these people just started wearing cowboy boots, and it's because of that kind of tight link, right? And so one of the things I think is super interesting is the way in which kind of cowboy culture has kind of spread kind of globally, and like especially in the UK. I was just up in Manchester and everyone's in plaid shirts all of a sudden again, right? And there seems to be some kind of link that wherever there is kind of capitalist redevelopment under this regime of kind of American hegemony, it takes those kind of founding myths and ideas that I think are really developed in the 50s.